The year is 1348. If you could step back into this world, the first thing you would notice is the silence. In the Kingdom of Valencia, the air is thick, not just with the heat of the Spanish sun, but with a tension that felt almost physical. This was a year that changed everything in Europe. It was the year the Black Death arrived. For the people living in the small villages of Albuera and Almazara, life was usually defined by the rhythm of the soil and the sea. They were farmers and laborers. They understood the seasons, the cycles of planting, and the tides. But 1348 brought a cycle they did not understand. A shadow was moving across the continent, and with it came a deep, existential fear. When people are faced with an invisible enemy, they look for anchors. In the 14th century, that anchor was faith. It was not just a Sunday obligation. It was the very fabric of their reality. It was how they measured time, how they found hope, and how they made sense of death. It is against this backdrop of crisis and devotion that our story takes place. It is a story about a simple journey, a sudden storm, and a series of events that the people of this region have refused to forget for nearly 700 years. To understand what happened, we have to understand the world these people inhabited. The mid-1300s were a time of transition. Spain was a mosaic of kingdoms, a place where different cultures brushed against one another under a scorching sun. But in 1348, those regional differences faded in the face of a common tragedy. The plague had reached the ports. It was moving inland. Every stranger on the road was a potential threat. Every cough was a cause for terror. The social order was fraying. In such a world, the role of the local priest was not merely religious. He was a pillar of the community, often one of the few who could read and write, and the person responsible for the spiritual safety of his flock. When the world seemed to be ending, the rituals of the church provided a sense of continuity. One of the most vital of these rituals was the care of the dying. To die alone or without the final rites was a fear that haunted the medieval mind more than death itself. In the small hamlet of Almazara, a man lay in a small stone house. We do not know his name, but we know his situation. He was at the end of his life. He was slipping away, and his final wish was to receive the Eucharist one last time. This request set in motion a chain of events that would eventually draw the attention of the entire region. It was a request that required a journey across a landscape that was about to become very dangerous. As the priest of Albuera prepared for his journey that day, he would have looked at the horizon. Perhaps he saw the clouds gathering. Perhaps he felt the change in the wind. But his duty was clear. He placed the sacred elements into a small, portable vessel known as a pyx, secured it within a bag, and began his walk toward Almazara. He was carrying what the villagers believed was the most precious substance on earth. He was walking into a landscape that was about to be transformed by the elements. This was not a grand procession. It was a humble act of service during a time of great suffering. The priest was likely alone or accompanied by a single assistant. They walked through the groves, past the irrigation channels that the Moors had built centuries before, heading toward the dry bed of the ravine. They could not have known that this routine journey would become the focal point of a story that would be told for centuries. They could not have known that the silence of 1348 was about to be broken by something they would struggle to explain for the rest of their lives. The distance between Albuera and Almazara is not great. In modern terms, it is a short drive, a matter of minutes. But in the 14th century, every kilometer was a deliberate undertaking. The path took the priest through the Huerta, the fertile ring of farmland that surrounds Valencia. This land was a lifeline for the region, a complex network of fields and orchards fed by ancient irrigation channels. On this day, the air would have been heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes a breaking storm. As the priest approached the Caraxit ravine, the atmosphere began to shift. In this part of Spain, The mountains are never truly far away. While it might be calm on the coast, a massive downpour miles inland can send a wall of water rushing toward the sea without warning. This phenomenon, known as a flash flood, remains a danger in the region even today. The dry, stony bed of the ravine, which had been a safe passage just hours before, was about to become a chaotic torrent. According to the historical accounts passed down through the generations, the priest reached the edge of the ravine just as the weather turned. The sky darkened, and the wind began to whip through the trees. He had a choice to make. He could turn back to the safety of the stone walls of Albarea, or he could push forward to fulfill his promise to the dying man. For a medieval priest, the spiritual stakes were absolute. The man in Almacera was waiting for his final piece. Turning back felt like a betrayal of his calling. He stepped into the ravine. At first, the water might have only been at his ankles, a manageable stream cutting through the dust. But as he reached the center, the situation changed rapidly. The water did not rise slowly. It arrived as a surge, carrying mud, debris, and the weight of the mountain rains. The footing beneath him, composed of loose silt and smooth river stones, became unstable. Imagine the scene from the priest's perspective. He is wearing long, heavy robes that begin to soak up the cold water, dragging him down. He is clutching the sacred vessel, trying to keep it above the rising tide. The sound would have been deafening, the roar of moving water and the clatter of stones being tumbled along the bottom. This was no longer a crossing. It was a struggle for survival. As he fought to maintain his balance, the force of the current became overwhelming. He stumbled. In that moment of panic and physical exhaustion, the vessel containing the sacred elements slipped from his grasp. It was swept away instantly. In the churn of the muddy water, there was no hope of seeing where it went. The priest himself barely managed to scramble to the far bank, gasping for air, safe but devastated. To a modern observer, losing a small object in a flood is a common, if unfortunate, accident. But to this priest, it was a catastrophe of the highest order. He believed he had lost the actual presence of the divine in a muddy ditch. He was standing on the bank, drenched and shivering, looking back at the brown, violent water that had swallowed his charge. He had failed the dying man, and he had failed his office. The reports from the time describe a man overcome with grief and guilt. He arrived in Almacera, but he did not bring the comfort he had intended. Instead, he brought news of a loss that shocked the small community. The news spread quickly from house to house. In a time when people felt abandoned by the world due to the plague, the loss of the Eucharist felt like a final, crushing blow. It was as if the one thing they could rely on had been taken by the very earth itself. The priest did not simply give up. Despite the danger, despite the exhaustion, a search was organized as soon as the waters began to recede. But the Eucharistic is a wide, shifting landscape. The flood had moved massive amounts of earth. The vessel could have been buried under feet of silt, or it could have been carried all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, which lies only a short distance to the east. The searchers moved along the banks, poking through the debris with sticks, their eyes scanning the drying mud for a glint of metal. They looked through the tangled roots of trees and the piles of reeds deposited by the current. Hours turned into a day. The hope of finding the vessel began to fade. The community was left in a state of mourning, a quiet, heavy sadness that mirrored the grim reality of the year 1348. However, the story does not end in the mud of the ravine. The Eucharistic flows into the sea, and it was there, where the fresh water meets the salt of the Mediterranean, that the narrative takes a turn. The focus of the village shifted from the ravine to the coast, where the local fishermen were beginning their day. They were men of the sea, used to the strange things that wash up after a storm. But what they reported seeing that morning was unlike anything they had encountered in all their years of labor. The transition from the chaos of the flood to the calm of the shoreline sets the stage for the next chapter of the event. It moves from a story of loss to a story of discovery. It is here that the accounts become more specific, detailing a sighting that would lead the priest and the entire village out of their despair and toward the water's edge. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a pale, scrubbed blue. The air was cooler now, smelling of salt and wet earth. While the village of Almacera remained in a state of quiet mourning, life by the sea continued as it always had. The Mediterranean coast near Valencia is a place of wide, sandy horizons and shallow waters. It was here, at the mouth of the Carexid ravine, where the silt from the flood was being pushed out into the sea, that the story shifted from a tragedy to something far more mysterious. Early that morning, a group of local fishermen went down to the shore to check their nets and assess the damage from the previous day's weather. These were men who lived by their eyes and their hands. They knew every shimmer on the water, every movement of the gulls, and every type of fish that inhabited these coastal shallows. They were not men given to flights of fancy or religious exaggeration. They were practical, hardened by a life of manual labor. As they stood near the spot where the brown water of the ravine met the blue of the sea, they noticed something unusual. According to the historical accounts, they saw two fish near the surface of the water. This in itself was not strange, but their behavior was. The fish were not darting away or feeding. They were stationary, buoyed up in the water, and they appeared to be holding something in their mouths. As the fishermen moved closer, the details became clearer. In the mouth of each fish was a small, white, circular object. The men watched, frozen in place, as the fish remained there, remarkably still despite the movement of the tide. They realized they were looking at the missing elements from the priest's vessel. The Eucharist, lost in the mud and chaos of the inland ravine, had somehow traveled the length of the watercourse, survived the crushing force of the flood, and emerged at the coast. The fishermen did not try to take the objects themselves. There was a profound sense of boundary in the medieval world. Some things belonged to the realm of the common man, and others belonged to the sacred. They knew immediately that this was connected to the loss the priest had suffered the day before. One of them was sent running back to the village, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he hurried through the orchards to find the priest. When the news reached the village, it was met with a mixture of shock and a sudden, electric hope. The priest, still burdened by the weight of his perceived failure, followed the messenger back to the shore. He was accompanied by a growing crowd of villagers. They walked quickly, driven by a need to see for themselves what the fishermen had described. When they arrived at the beach, the scene was exactly as it had been told. There, in the shallows, the two fish were waiting. They were not large or remarkable fish, just common creatures of the Mediterranean, but they remained perfectly poised. The crowd gathered at the water's edge, falling into a deep, respectful silence. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves and the distant cry of birds. The priest, according to the records of the event, waded into the water. He was still wearing his simple clerical garments, which once again became soaked by the sea. He approached the fish slowly, perhaps expecting them to vanish into the depths as soon as he drew near. But they did not move. As he reached out his hands, the accounts state that the fish dropped the white discs into his palms and then turned, disappearing back into the deeper water. The atmosphere on the beach at that moment is described as one of overwhelming relief. For the people of 1348, this was not just about the recovery of lost property. In a year defined by death and the feeling that the heavens were closed, this event felt like a sign that they had not been forgotten. It was a moment of light in a very dark century. The priest stood in the shallows, holding the recovered elements. They were reportedly dry and intact, despite their journey through the flood and their time in the sea. To the witnesses, This was the most baffling part of the entire ordeal. The physical fragility of the bread should have meant its immediate destruction in the water, yet there it was, returned to them. The group began the walk back to the village, but the mood was entirely different from the journey down. The news spread like a wildfire through the huerta. People came out from their farmhouses, leaning on their tools, watching as the small procession passed by. There was no shouting or loud celebration. Instead, there was a hushed, reverent energy. The two fish had become the central figures in a story that was already beginning to define the identity of the town. This was the moment the miracle of the fish was born. It was a story of the small and the humble, a local priest, some simple fishermen, and two creatures of the sea intertwining in a way that offered the community a sense of purpose. But as with any event of this nature, the story didn't end with a recovery. It was only the beginning of a long process of investigation, documentation, and the building of a legacy that would endure for hundreds of years. The walk back from the shore to the heart of the village was no longer a frantic search or a somber trek of failure. It had transformed into something else entirely. As the priest walked with his hands held out, shielding the recovered elements, the small group of fishermen and villagers began to grow. Word travels fast in a landscape where people live and work closely together. By the time the group reached the outskirts of the town, the path was lined with people who had dropped their sickles and left their kitchens to witness the return. This was the beginning of what would become a deep-seated tradition in the region. The procession moved slowly, governed by a natural, unforced rhythm. There was no music, no ringing bells at first, only the sound of hundreds of feet moving over the dry earth. In the 14th century, a procession was a powerful communal act. It was a way for a village to reclaim its space, to walk together in a shared direction, and to find a sense of order in a world that often felt chaotic. When they reached the church, the atmosphere shifted from the open, natural environment of the beach to the enclosed, sacred space of the stone building. The priest placed the elements back into a secure vessel. It was only then, within the safety of those thick walls, that the full weight of the event began to sink in for the community. The fear that had gripped the village since the storm and the larger fear brought by the plague seemed to lift, if only for a moment. The reaction of the community was not one of wild hysteria. This is a common misconception about the Middle Ages. While the people were deeply religious, they were also grounded in the reality of their daily lives. Their reaction was characterized by a profound, quiet reflection. To them, the event was a consolation. In 1348, the word consolation carried a heavy meaning. It meant a sign of hope in the midst of despair. It was a reminder that even when the social and physical world seemed to be falling apart, there was still a sense of underlying meaning. However, an event like this could not remain a local secret. In the 14th century, the church was a highly organized institution with a strict hierarchy. Reports of unusual events were handled with a mixture of interest and caution. The authorities in the city of Valencia, just a few miles away, had to be informed. This was not a matter of simply believing a story. It was about documentation and verification. Witnesses were called to give their accounts. The fisherman, the priest, and the villagers who had stood on the shore were asked to describe exactly what they had seen. This was a formal process. The church was wary of false claims or misunderstandings. They looked for consistency in the stories. They asked about the weather, the behavior of the fish, and the condition of the elements when they were recovered. According to the records that have survived, the consistency of the testimonies was remarkable. The fishermen, who had no reason to invent such a story, were particularly influential. They were seen as reliable observers of the natural world. Their description of the fish holding the objects in their mouths became the defining image of the event. It was an image that was easy to understand and impossible to forget. As the investigation continued, the local impact became more permanent. The people of Almasara and Alburea did not want the memory of the event to fade. They began to mark the locations. The spot on the bank of the Caraxet where the vessel was lost, and the spot on the beach where the fish appeared, became landmarks of memory. These were no longer just points on a map. They were parts of a living history. The reaction also extended into the art and architecture of the region. Soon after the event, plans were discussed to build a commemorative structure. They wanted a place where people could go to reflect on the story. This eventually led to the construction of a small chapel near the site of the recovery. This chapel, known as the Ermita del Milagro de las Peces, or the Chapel of the Miracle of the Fish, still stands as a testament to the impact the story had on the local people. It is interesting to note how the community's identity began to wrap itself around this single afternoon in 1348. The two fish became a symbol for the town. You can still see this symbol today in local carvings, paintings, and even in the town's celebrations. For a small village, having a story that was recognized by the wider world gave them a sense of dignity and place. In the face of the Black Death, which stripped people of their names and their histories, this story gave them something to hold onto. But beyond the official investigations and the building of stone walls, there was a more human reaction. The story changed how the people looked at their landscape. The Caraxet ravine was no longer just a dangerous watercourse. It was a place of a significant journey. The sea was no longer just a source of food. It was a witness. The natural world and the spiritual world had met for a brief moment on a Spanish beach, and for the people of 1348, that was enough to change the way they saw their future. To truly understand why the story of the two fish resonated so deeply, we have to step away from the physical details for a moment and look at the emotional landscape of the 14th century. We are currently at about the midway point of our journey through this history, and it is here that we find the heart of the matter. Why did this specific event, in this specific corner of Spain, become a legend that outlasted the very kingdom it was born in? The answer lies in the human need for meaning during times of absolute crisis. In 1348, the world felt like it was breaking. The plague was not just a medical catastrophe, it was a psychological one. It took away the ability to plan for the future. It took away the comfort of a peaceful death. It made the world feel random, cruel, and indifferent. When the priest lost that vessel in the flood, it wasn't just a religious accident. To the people watching, it felt like a metaphor for their lives. They felt lost, swept away by forces far greater than themselves, disappearing into the muddy waters of history. Then, the fish appeared. In the eyes of a medieval villager, the appearance of the fish was a powerful reversal of that despair. It suggested that even in the chaos of a flash flood, even in the vastness of the Mediterranean Sea, nothing is truly lost. There is a profound psychological comfort in the idea of recovery. The story told them that despite the plague, despite the fear, there was an order to the universe. There was a witness watching over them, even if that witness was as humble as a fish in the shallows. This reflection on hope is what kept the story alive through the generations. It wasn't about proving a miracle to a skeptic. It was about providing a narrative of resilience to a survivor. For the people of Alburea and Almasara, the miracle wasn't just the recovery of the objects. It was the recovery of their community's spirit. It gave them a reason to gather, to talk, and to build. It gave them a shared history that was defined by a moment of light rather than the darkness of the Black Death. We also have to consider the simplicity of the story. Many religious accounts from the Middle Ages are dense with complicated theology or dramatic, fiery visions. But the two-fish miracle is remarkably grounded. It involves water, earth, common laborers, and animals. There are no thundering voices from the sky. There is only a quiet, strange moment on a beach. This simplicity made it accessible. A farmer in the fields or a mother in her home could relate to the idea of something precious being lost and then found. It was a human-scale story in a world that had become terrifyingly large and unpredictable. Even the choice of the fish as the central actors in the story carries a quiet weight. Since the earliest days of the faith, the fish had been a symbol of identity and hidden meaning. By returning to this ancient symbol in the year 1348, the story connected the suffering people of Spain to a much longer lineage of endurance. It told them they were part of a story that began long before the plague and would continue long after it had passed. As we look back from the modern era, we can see this event as a study in human perception. Whether one views it through the lens of faith or as a powerful piece of folklore that served as a communal coping mechanism, the result is the same. It functioned as a bridge. It bridged the gap between the terror of the unknown and the comfort of the known. It allowed a group of people to look at the very water that had threatened to drown their priest and see it instead as a medium of return. This reflection reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and casualty counts. It is a collection of stories. In the grand timeline of the 14th century, the loss and recovery of a small vessel in a Spanish ravine might seem like a minor footnote. But for the people who lived it, it was the center of the world. It was the thing they told their children. It was the reason they stayed in their villages and rebuilt their lives after the sickness passed. It was, in the truest sense of the word, an anchor. While the spiritual reflection gives us the why, the historical investigation gives us the how. How do we actually know about this event today? It wasn't just passed down through whispers and bedtime stories. The miracle of the fish left a paper trail and a physical footprint that historians have studied for centuries. Shortly after the events of 1348, the church authorities in Valencia began the formal process of canonical verification. In the medieval world, the church was an institution of law as much as faith. They did not take claims of the supernatural lightly. In fact, they were often the first to look for natural explanations. They looked into the tides, the currents of the Caraxet, and the character of the witnesses. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the historical impact of this event is the Arqueta del Milagro, the chest of the miracle. This was a specially commissioned reliquary designed to hold the recovered elements. The fact that the community invested significant resources into creating a work of art so soon after a major economic depression caused by the plague speaks to the absolute certainty of those who were there. They weren't just memorializing a story. They were preserving what they saw as physical proof of an extraordinary moment. In the centuries that followed, the story underwent several periods of renewed interest. During the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, Spanish artists and writers looked back at 1348 with a sense of wonder. They saw it as a foundational moment for the region's identity. The Archbishop of Valencia in the 16th century, San Juan de Ribera, was a major proponent of the story. He saw in it a powerful tool for teaching and communal unity. Under his influence, the documentation was organized, and the traditions were formalized. This formalization is why we have such specific details today. We know the names of the locations. We know the exact geography of the ravine. We know how the village of Almazara eventually gained its own parish independence, a move that was deeply tied to the prestige of being the site of the miracle. The event essentially put the village on the map, shifting its status from a humble collection of houses to a destination for travelers and the curious. There is also the matter of the ermita, the chapel. Built near the site where the fish were seen, it has been renovated and maintained for nearly 700 years. When you stand in that space today, you are standing in a structure that was built specifically because of a single afternoon in the 14th century. The architecture itself serves as a historical document. The stones, the orientation of the building toward the sea, and the inscriptions found within it all point back to the same narrative. But history is also about change. Over the years, the way the story was told evolved. In the 1300s, it was a story of survival and consolation. In the 1600s, it became a story of institutional triumph and artistic beauty. In the modern era, it has become a study in cultural heritage. Yet, through all these changes, the core of the story, the priest, the storm, the fish, has remained untouched. It is a rare example of a narrative that has survived the transition from the medieval to the modern world without losing its essential character. The investigation into the two fish also tells us a lot about the people of Valencia themselves. They are a people with a deep connection to the water. The sea and the irrigation channels are the lifeblood of their land. It is fitting that their most famous local story involves these elements. It reflects a culture that understands both the danger and the bounty of the natural world. To them, it made perfect sense that if a message of hope were to be delivered, it would come from the water. As we look at this story from the perspective of the 21st century, we find ourselves in a very different world than the one inhabited by the villagers of 1348. We have mapped the currents of the Mediterranean. We understand the meteorology of flash floods. We have conquered the plague that once decimated the population of Europe. To a modern mind, the story of the two fish can be viewed through many different lenses. Some see it as a beautiful piece of regional folklore, a myth that helped a community survive a time of trauma. Others see it as a documented historical anomaly that challenges our understanding of the natural world. But regardless of one's personal interpretation, the cultural weight of the event remains undeniable. Today, the miracle of the fish is not just a dusty chapter in a history book. It is a vibrant part of the local identity in Alburea and Almacera. Every year, the community gathers to commemorate the event. They walk the same paths. They look out over the same sea. In doing so, they are not just reenacting a ritual. They are maintaining a thread of continuity that stretches back 7 centuries. In an era where the world changes at a dizzying pace, there is something profoundly grounding about a story that stays the same. The two fish remind us that the human experience is consistent. We still face uncertainty. We still seek hope in the midst of crisis. We still find meaning in the world around us. The modern perspective allows us to appreciate the story not just for its supernatural elements, but for its role as a vessel of human memory. It is a reminder that the stories we choose to keep are the ones that tell us who we are. History is often told through the lives of kings, the movement of armies, and the shifting of borders. But the story of the two fish of 1348 suggests that history is also made in the quiet moments between ordinary people and the world they inhabit. It is made by a priest trying to do his duty in a storm. It is made by fishermen standing on a beach at dawn. It is made by a village that refused to let a moment of hope be swallowed by the shadows of a dark century. The year 1348 will always be remembered for the Black Death, a time of immense loss and suffering. Yet, in this small corner of Spain, it is also remembered for a moment of recovery. This contrast is perhaps the most important lesson of the narrative. It suggests that even in the most desperate of times, the human spirit is capable of finding light. It suggests that we are never truly alone, and that even the smallest creatures can play a role in a story much larger than themselves. As we conclude this journey through the history of the miracle of the fish, we are left with an image that has endured for nearly 700 years. Two fish, steady in the water, holding something precious until it could be returned to its rightful place. It is an image of patience, of stewardship, and of a strange, quiet peace. We may never know every detail of what happened on that Spanish shore so long ago. The records provide us with the what and the where, but the how remains a mystery. Perhaps that is how it is meant to be. Some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered. They are meant to remind us that the world is a place of wonder, that history is a tapestry of both the seen and the unseen, and that sometimes, against all odds, what is lost can be found again. The bells of Albarraya and Almacera still ring, much as they did centuries ago. The Carexit ravine still waits for the mountain rains, and the story of the two fish continues to be told, a silent witness to the endurance of faith, the power of memory, and the unbreakable resilience of the human heart.